First of all, I'm delighted to be chairing this GSF Roundtable on the Middle East, given the changing dynamics of the region and perhaps ideas on breaking the seemingly unending cycle of conflict. And I'm delighted to welcome back, in that context, to GSF, Alastair Crooke, who's the Director of Conflicts Forum and formerly advisor on the Middle East to Javier Solana, Eugene Rogan, the Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of Oxford, Fellow of St. Antony's College and a multi-award-winning author, and last but certainly not least, Jane Kinninmont, who joined the European Leadership Network last year as Director of Impact and was previously Head of Programs at the Elders and Deputy Head and Senior Research Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. So we have some very distinguished speakers to lead our discussion today. I know they need no introduction to those with me for this Zoom today. For those watching on our YouTube channel at a later date, their full biographies are available on our website at www.globalstrategyforum. So hopefully you'll be able to follow it fully in that way. Just a housekeeping note to start off with. Alastair, Eugene and Jane will speak to us for between 5 and 7 minutes each, if that's all right, in that order. And then I will chair a roundtable conversation. If you can use the raised hand function to let me know you'd like to speak, I will call on you. And if you would keep yourself on mute until then, that would be great. And Ning Campbell has already notified me he's going to have to leave at 12, so I'll try and bring him in early. There is a lot to unpack when we're looking at what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. The political landscape in the region has changed quite dramatically over the last few months. There's Israel domestically, and the question of what the post-Netanyahu era and the new leadership of Naftali Bennett will bring, and what that might mean, not least for the two-state solution. We can perhaps have a look at that. Then Israel externally and its relations in the region. It now has peace agreements with 6 Arab states. There's what's happening in Lebanon, what's happening in Jordan, and of course Iran's relations both with its neighbors and with the West, including the future, if it has a future, of the JCPOA. There's the situation in Syria, Turkey's role in the region, and then relations with the West, with a new president in the White House, and what are the hopes that Joe Biden will be willing or able to move the dial on securing stability in the region in a way that sadly has not been possible over the last years. And then we can look to see what are Russia and China's positions, because those are going to become more and more relevant as time goes on. And what are the new patterns and relationships that are emerging in the region? So I think we've got plenty to discuss today. I've just thrown those out as possible ideas you might want to pick up. But I think we'll go straight, without further ado, we'll go straight to begin the discussion. And Alastair Crooke, would you like to start us off?
Well, thank you. Well, clearly, Michael, after that list of topics that we should discuss, 5 minutes is not going to really suffice very far, but I just want to highlight just a couple of things in this period. I mean, first of all, I want to really highlight the discussion that is not taking place in the West and why it's important. We've just had all of the visuals in this last week about the prolongation of the narrative of the West, human rights, democracies versus autocracies, the threat from the East coming back to replace the terrorist threat and the threat from communism, the new threat of the beast from the East coming to us. But underlying all of that, despite the words of Macron about how really it was just a gathering of the family again, it felt so good, and even Boris talking about how it was really like going back to school and seeing your old mates again. Underneath it, of course, there were a lot of disagreements, particularly about China. And the European Union and Macron and others were very clear in trying to reduce the, if you like, the belligerence towards China and to differentiate it and divide it into military, into trade, and into other issues like human rights, if you like, and not just lump it in a belligerent single category. But the point I was wanting really to make is, despite all these visuals, despite the language coming out, and of course, we saw very clearly what happened in NATO in one sense is that at NATO, the Western Europeans knew that they needed to bring Biden on board because they want to start trade talks with them. And the price of that was to say unpleasant things about China. But the East Europeans in NATO certainly focused on Russia. So when we get the last end of the NATO summit declaration, there are something like 68 mentions of Russia and only 10 of China. And today we, of course, have the summit taking place between Biden and Putin. But what I want to say is that against this background of a seeming prolongation of the unipolar moment of America, America is back, America at the helm, actually the geostrategic situation has moved, and is moving in a very different direction. And that is something we don't really discuss very much. I will start off by just saying that the situation in the Middle East, and by which I mean particularly the situation of Israel, is much more serious, more grave than is widely understood. Because we have had now some 10 years of Netanyahu talking mission accomplished. The Palestinian issue has been put to sleep. The world has moved on. We are not involved in that any longer. Israel is quite capable of going in periodically, bombing Gaza, and bringing about an end to violence there. The reality is, Israel has lost its military edge. The military edge that it used to have, freedom of flight over the skies, is now really reserved for Gaza, but not much beyond that. Israel is surrounded by smart cruise missiles, ground-hugging cruise missiles, and drones. And drones are a formidable weapon. They're not toys for children. When you have 100 drones in the air, all intercommunicating and armed, it is a formidable weapon, and one which radar and air defenses cannot adequately deal with. So while we've all been preoccupied and endlessly concerned about the nuclear weapon and the JCPOA, Iran and its allies have quietly put a completely different deterrence on the ground. Hundreds of thousands of these missiles ranging from Gaza to Lebanon, to Syria, to Iraq. Even the Yemenis, the Houthis, have cruise missiles that are capable of striking Tel Aviv now. And in this last fracas with Hamas, the Houthis volunteered to be given a few targets for bombing too, if Hamas would like it. So the military situation is completely inverted. The military edge is essentially with, if you like, the resistance axis. I know it's a term people don't like, but with the resistance axis where these missiles are. It is, if you like, the red pill. It is, in a way, Qasem Soleimani's legacy, this red pill, that if Israel goes further, then they can have a multi-front war, and in which their air defenses will not be able to cope with swarms and multiple missile attacks. To make it more pointed, during this last exchanges with Hamas, Hamas succeeded in turning the conflict from one about Gaza and about lifting the siege in Gaza to about being Al-Aqsa and protecting the mosque and the compound Haram al-Sharif and protecting Jerusalem. And of course, Al-Aqsa is now something that mobilizes every Muslim, because the Saudis have really turned Mecca and Medina into a sort of commercial shopping mall. I mean, it's lost most of its sort of spirituality. Al-Aqsa still has that for people. So the strategic shift, which was reinforced when the Secretary General of Hezbollah said very clearly that if there is a provocation against Al-Aqsa, again, as there was that started this recent round of conflict, if there is another provocation against Al-Aqsa, when the settlers tried to burn it down and to storm it, and then the police went in to Al-Aqsa, another one of those, and we will join with Hamas in the next round. And others will too. This is highly coordinated. IRGC are communicating with Hamas all the time, and with other groups in Iraq and in Syria as well. And I concluded one of the articles I just wrote a little while ago saying a provocation on Al-Aqsa is not probable, it's inevitable. For all of you who know what the settlers are like and their determination to take Al-Aqsa and build a third temple on that site, you will know that a provocation there, if it's not generated by Netanyahu, which the last one was, it will be generated by one of these cults that are settler cults. At the same time, Israel has moved dramatically. The Israeli public have accepted Netanyahu's narrative of mission accomplished, and it has moved very strongly to the right. And what we're seeing in Israel at the moment has been actually the right is eating the right alive, eating each other up. There's a big fight between the more liberal settler interests, like Bennett is one, with the religious right, who have moved away from defending the land of Israel and now are opposed to leftist and to all what they call postmodernity. A big shift that's taken place. And that big shift means that the two-state solution, there is no prospect. 72% of Israelis just did not want a ceasefire. They wanted the bombing of Gaza just to go on and on. That is the metric of the change that has taken place in Israel. There's no room for leftists. When a few leftists tried to protest in Jerusalem, they were told by the police that 1,000 armed right-wing thugs were coming for them in the square in Jerusalem, and the police were not going to defend them, and if they wanted to stay, it was up to them. Of course, they left. You saw what happened for the first time. Now we have also the 48 Palestinians united with those of Gaza and with the West Bank. The first time in 30 years, we've seen that. And it marks really the end of the one-state solution too, because in a sense, all of the one-state solution is based on the premise that the 48 Palestinians would come to terms and would assimilate and become Israelis over a generation or so. In fact, they've been left in the doldrum, subject to crime and breakdown. And so they face a very different, bleak future. And so they now are part of Hamas. So you have Hamas representing the West Bank, the 48, and Gaza. So a big strategic change. And at the same time, if Israel takes action on Jerusalem, either against the Palestinians there on Al-Aqsa, we may have a full-scale war. And people are configuring for that, by the way. And it is coordinated. There's daily contact on this. And I just want to extend this very briefly, and I know I'm running out of time, but just for a very short thing to say, the strategic balance has shifted everywhere. By everywhere, I mean Russia. In 2018, Putin said, I've achieved strategic equivalence to the United States. What he meant was that his hyper Mach 10 missiles that were hypersonic had changed the whole balance of military power. The old recipe of the United States of taking out Russia's ICBMs and using its anti-ballistic missile system in Poland and elsewhere to destroy any retaliation by Russia is over. The Russian hypersonic missiles make that impossible. China is in the same position, and these states are embracing a much tougher line. We've been told that Biden is going to read out the red lines to Mr. Putin. I suspect that Mr. Putin, as he did in his address to the federal government, will read out the red lines back to the United States. And let me be clear, you have Israel, if you like, in the Middle East, but then you have Taiwan, as, can I put it very loosely, as a sort of a coming Israel being cultivated by the United States inside China from the perspective of the Chinese. And you have, if you like, the Ukraine as a new bastion of Western values and Western civilization, another colonial project being incubated in the Ukraine. Both of these are absolute red lines. And recently, the National Security Advisor of Russia warned very clearly, don't mistake our red lines. Putin said the same thing. Don't mistake them this time, because actually it's not going to be a question of economic sanctions or retaliation. We intend to respond to any provocations with military force. So, Michael, I'll stop there and just saying that we are facing really an inversion of the strategic picture, but it's not discussed. It's too difficult. So everyone goes back and says, well, we must go to return to the two-state solution in Palestine, but it's gone. The one-state solution is gone. Israel no longer has the military edge. What is to be done about it? No one wants to discuss this. Israelis, a few of them discuss it, but mostly they just rely on bombing Gaza periodically. So that is the situation. No one discusses these things, but they are becoming much more pertinent as we go on. Michael.
Alastair, thank you very much indeed. You say nobody discusses these issues. Perhaps we'll discuss some of them this morning in the course of this next hour.
I hope so.
You'll certainly give us a lot of food for thought. I'm now going to call on Eugene Rogan, if he could also give us a few thoughts over 5 or 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think because Alastair was really so fluent in setting out the ground, I'll be able to concentrate on just sort of one point that I'd like to bring to the group's attention. And that really is the way in which the transition from the Trump era to the Biden era is affecting the region. For 4 years, it's not as though the Americans pursued distinctive policies. Trump rather had a way of doing things rather than a set of strategic or policy-driven initiatives. And with the end of the Trump era, and now with the end of the Netanyahu era, we're seeing several of the leaders who were responsible for empowering the policies that proved, for the Middle East, quite destabilizing, moving out, and there's a shifting of the guard taking place. We see in the Biden administration a return to experienced diplomats, experienced civil servants, people who actually know the system and observe the rules. And that represents, with no irony or jokes, a major transformation in the way America is engaging with the world. We saw it at the G7 meeting. And Biden is constantly trying to say to his audience that America is back, and America is back as a force to uphold the rule of law and its international commitments. And this holds certain implications for the Middle East, which I think all came home to us in a rather extraordinary set of events that took place in Jordan in April, when we saw the former crown prince put under house arrest, the king claiming that there were insurgents working against his regime inside Jordan, and the region itself quiver. And I see all this as, if you like, an extension of the Trump way of doing things and the way that Trump worked through certain regional actors. And it all comes back to the attempt to try and create the deal of a century to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and the Abraham Accords to try and bring as many Arab countries into peaceful relations with Israel as could be achieved. So just to remind everyone, in April, we had this extraordinary footage broadcast on the BBC where Prince Hamza, former crown prince to Abdullah II, son of King Hussein and Queen Noor, claimed that he'd been placed under house arrest for no provocation, that his access to the outside world and all communication was about to be cut. And these videos are probably his last form of messaging the world about what was happening. We know that about 20 people were arrested in Jordan, two rather prominent people, one being Bassem Awadallah. Awadallah had been chief of royal court under Abdullah II, and then had since moved on to become an economic advisor to MBS in Saudi Arabia. The second was Sharif Hassan bin Zaid, who by his name, I don't know Sharif Hassan, but I assume he's part of the Iraqi branch of the Hashemite family of Zayd bin Rad's descendants. But he would be a remote relative of Abdullah's. These two men were the only names that you could find who had been put under arrest, and they were very prominent. And then the third element that comes out in the breaking news in April is, out of nowhere, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, parachutes into Amman to declare his country's total support for Abdullah II and his government, and dismissing any rumors of Saudi involvement as far-fetched nonsense, which is as close to a confession as these things get in the Middle East. So what was going on and why? Over the weekend, David Ignatius, the Washington Post correspondent, wrote a very revealing report which draws heavily on a Jordanian muhabarat or intelligence document, which is the basis of the Jordanian case that's being prosecuted against the supporters of what appears to have been a coup attempt from within the royal family. Very briefly, what Ignatius reveals is that the plot goes right back, as I said, to Trump's effort to try and foster peace between Israel and the Palestinians on terms that were really very slanted in favor of Israel. And one of the regional partners most opposed to the terms was actually Abdullah II, and that, for grounds that Alastair Crooke will appreciate, had to do with Jordan's custodianship over Jerusalem. The idea of surrendering Palestinian or Arab or Islamic claims to Jerusalem, such as were envisaged by the deal that Trump was hammering out, was a red line that Abdullah would not cross. And this then put Abdullah in the way of drawing Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords, which was something that MBS himself was very keen to do. MBS is very close to Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was very keen to be seen to be siding with the Trump administration's policies on the region, saw those as being in Saudi Arabia's national interest. And as we know, MBS himself has never been particularly hesitant to destabilize other leaders in the region if it would serve what he perceived to be Saudi interests. Now, against Abdullah II's resistance to the deal of the century on the grounds of what it meant for Jerusalem, the idea of bruiting Hamza as an alternative to Abdullah II gained ground. And the Saudi link and the link to MBS seems reinforced by the involvement both of Awadallah, who is now a very close economic advisor to MBS, and Sharif Hassan, who had served as Abdullah II's envoy to Saudi Arabia. They too have a connection, if you like, between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. The idea was to encourage Hamza to cultivate a support base among Jordanian tribes. And indeed, this is one of the reasons that Abdullah II cites for the house arrest and for the suspicion cast over Prince Hamza's role in trying to revive his claim on his own popular support base within Jordan to succeed his father, King Hussein, and displace his brother, his half-brother, Abdullah II. And the support that the tribes had shown for Hamza, a very popular man within Jordan, was part of what seemed to be setting up the momentum for a coup. All of this was revealed just before the main protagonists, Awadallah and Sharif Hassan, were due to leave Jordan in April, which would be the moment in which the tribes would then go to work in calling for Hamza to succeed him. And it was at that moment that the Jordanian muhabarat intervened so dramatically, placing Prince Hamza himself under house arrest. Now, we have seen in the aftermath of these developments that the Jordanians have tried to put their own house in order. Prince Hassan, himself a former crown prince, brother of late King Hussein, served as the broker between Prince Hamza and King Abdullah. There was then the announcement that Hamza had given his total loyalty to King Abdullah, and that peace and order was restored in the Hashemite family, though it seems far from entirely restored. What clearly has transpired, though, is that the Trump era way of doing things is now being brought to an end. The first Arab leader who will get a meeting with President Biden will be Abdullah II. MBS himself is now in something of purdah. He has not been received by Biden. Biden has published the American intelligence report that implicated MBS in the brutal killing of the Saudi dissident and journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And so if we talk about a transition of the Trump era, which we see with the passing of Trump and now the replacement of Netanyahu, the question mark really is over, by what means do you see the transition in Saudi Arabia away from an MBS continuance of these ways of doing things? MBS's own record for destabilizing the region through the Qatar blockade, through the forced resignation on Saudi TV of the then Lebanese prime minister, and of course the role in the war in Yemen, goes to show how MBS is really quite willing to break eggs to make a Saudi omelet. But whether he has the support to do so through the international community, or indeed whether the pressures on MBS will be such as to constrain his mode of action, remains to be seen. But I'm not saying the end of the Trump way of doing things has been arrived at, because both Trump and Netanyahu have made it quite loud and quite clear that both of them intend to return. And I think within the Middle East, as within the world at large, there's a real question mark over whether the Biden's way of doing things will become a return to the American normal, or whether there's a prospect within 3.5 years' time that we might be pitched into the chaos that has marked the past 4 years. Let me stop there, Michael, and pass the floor.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I'm now going to ask Jane Kinninmont if she would take on from there and give us a little extra view before I open it up to the general audience.
Thank you. I'd like to say a few words, I think, about the economic issues that the Middle East is currently facing and what that means for peace and security. Because just like everywhere else, COVID and the lockdowns and disruption that it has led to has massively intensified inequality and created an even bigger gap in a region where inequality is already a huge issue within countries and also between countries. And, you know, none of the world has come out fantastically well in terms of helping each other through this period. But the weakness of regional cooperation in the Arab world has been particularly apparent at this time, where Arab states have generally done very little to help one another through this crisis, and their joint efforts have paled, you know, in comparison to the African Union, for example. But what we are seeing now is a growing sense that governments need to focus on the economy, and that in some cases it is time to step back from expensive proxy wars. Even the richest states have to contend with immediate disruptions to the trade and tourism that they need. And looking ahead beyond the impact of COVID, they also have serious questions about the future of their main resource, oil. There's been an interesting debate over the past month because the International Energy Agency said that if the world is going to reach net zero emissions by 2050, there is no need for more investment in oil and gas. And Saudi Arabia and Russia naturally have found common ground in saying that this is not true and that they will ramp up those investments. But of course, they are all very worried about what this will mean in terms of the future of government revenue, employment, and their ability to sustain the living standards to which their youth have become so accustomed. Then when you look at the poorer countries, the situation's far worse. You know, very long-term worries about the impact on children and refugee children in particular when it comes to education. And the IMF is talking about the tourism-dependent countries of the region facing a kind of economic scarring which could last for several years. So together with a new kind of mood in America, I think this desperate economic situation in the region is at least leading to a rethink about the priorities that governments should have at this time. And we see, looking at the Gulf countries who have in some cases taken on very assertive or aggressive foreign policies in recent years, that they've managed to mend fences between Qatar and the other Gulf states. There are various Saudi efforts to try to exit the war in Yemen. There's de-escalation in Libya, normalization by some countries with Israel, and interestingly, by some of the same countries with the Syrian government. There's a lot of noise about the JCPOA, but broadly, those that oppose it seem to accept that it is coming back, and they seem to be trying to push the US to go further rather than to undo the agreement. So there are some opportunities currently for diplomacy and for de-escalation, but they might not last very long. There are still deep internal insecurities and fragility inside many of these countries, even the rich ones. We've seen in the past couple of years leaders once again toppled by protests in Algeria and Sudan and Iraq, underlining that in most countries of the region, there's not much of a way to change your leadership without resorting to protests or to violence. We have now a suppressed yearning for democracy in the Palestinian territories, which were promised elections this year, which now do not seem to be going ahead. So the internal ferment that we've been observing for more than a decade in the region is still there and is still very much a driver for conflict. And I think just to link it back to those discussions about Russia and China and the US, the US and Western countries could be doing a lot more to offer support with dealing with the core economic issues, the challenges of unemployment and education and diversification away from oil. It doesn't look at present like China is craving dominance in the Middle East. I remember one Chinese analyst saying to me once that China regarded the Middle East as a graveyard for great powers. And I thought that was something very telling. It's not attractive to replace the US in the region. But Russia has been going to the Middle East and offering them not only arms, but vaccines. And China has a lot to offer in terms of advice on economic development, on trade, on infrastructure development, and so forth. In this context, internationally, it's not a good time for the UK to be cutting its foreign aid, including to the conflict zones like Syria and Yemen. And I would argue that the US should be thinking much, much more about economic development. If it doesn't want to foot the bill itself, then there are opportunities even to partner with China and others in trying to solve those issues and give the young people that make up the majority of the population a bit more hope in a better future.
Thank you very much, Jane. Very interesting comparison to the other speakers, and I think we can pick up some of those points. I'm very grateful to you. Given the time is running on, I'm going to try and take 2 questions at a time so we can get as many questions in as possible. The first 2 I've got are, first of all, David Manning, and secondly, David Hannay. So David Manning, would you like to ask your question?
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to our contributors. A quick observation, if I may, about Israel. I'm sure Alastair's right that Israel has new problems to confront given what happened a couple of weeks ago, and internal communal tensions, and obviously extraordinary challenge for Israel, though it's also worth remembering that we have an Arab party involved in the coalition. So it's quite a complicated landscape. And I, for one, would be less sure than Alastair is that Israel has lost its military edge. I think it may be finding its internal politics much more difficult. But strategically, anyway, Israel seems to me to have more room for maneuver than it did, not least because of the situation now with its relations with the Gulf. But anyway, let me move to my question, which I don't know, perhaps it's to Eugene, really. You said that, how things have changed with Trump. What I'd be interested to know is how far you think the Middle East can be a priority for Biden when he's obviously preoccupied at the moment with rebuilding the Western alliance, worrying about China, deciding how to handle Russia. And of course, the Middle East has a habit of making itself the issue, whether you want it to be or not. But do you think he will be proactive? And do you think that it is possible that he could encourage some kind of beginnings of rapprochement between the Arabs and Iran? Or is this completely pie in the sky? Because clearly, if that relationship changed, many other things might change in the Middle East as well.
Thank you. David Haney?
Yes. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Good. Two questions, if I could, with some overlap with David Manning's. Question number one. Having listened to the three presentations, as you say, Michael, they're quite sharply contrasted. I'm a little bit closer to Jane's presentation than I am to the other two somewhat doom-laden ones. But I would just ask about the Palestinian issue. It seems to me, and I entirely agree with Alastair's analysis, that both the two-state and the one-state solutions don't look terribly viable, either of them at the moment. But what does seem clear in recent years and months is that the policy of what I would call malign neglect of Palestine, which was the policy pursued by Trump and Jared Kushner, is not working. It hasn't worked. Palestine hasn't gone away, whether you're talking about Al-Aqsa or the settlements or Gaza, etc. But obviously, if one's trying to find some way of taking account of that, rather than just sticking your head in the sand and assuming it doesn't matter terribly, which I think it does, you've got to think of some way out of it. What is the process by which we, the West, Britain, the rest of Europe, the United States, others, might get back into a discussion which would reduce the risks of a further outbreak of hostilities? Second question, what does the panel think is the role of Iran in the Middle East of the future? It's no good saying there won't be one. Iran is the most populous country in the region. It's one which bringing it into hostilities with the West would be quite disastrous. And so what place do you give Iran? And if it's a reasonably substantial place, how do you get it there with the agreement of other countries? And that was, I think, part of David Manning's last question. How can you broker some kind of détente between Saudi and some of the other Arabs and in the Gulf and Iran? So two rather large issues there.
Thank you, David. Eugene, David Manning, I think, aimed one of his questions at you. Would you like to deal with that first, and then I'll ask the others to come in on the rest of it?
With pleasure, Michael. And greetings, David. Great to see you. I think everyone has been asking this question. It's very clear that for Biden, the Middle East is a second-order priority. He's got much bigger issues to contend with that he sees as far more pressing on the American national interest. But as you rightly noted, the Middle East has a way of imposing, and America is still exposed in the region. Obviously, Biden is committed to withdrawing the troops from Afghanistan. He will also want to find a way to reduce America's presence in Iraq and Syria, small though it is. And he will be looking for a way to try and stabilize the situation in Israel-Palestine, because the latest Gaza war was something which proved to be an issue in which America did have to intervene by a quieter form of diplomacy than we had grown used to under Trump. So it may be in the American strategic interest to begin to put in place proactive measures to try and stop the Middle East from becoming a zone of conflict that will draw America in either militarily or diplomatically, or put its relationships with key partners and allies in jeopardy. And all I would say is the evidence would seem to me that Biden no longer wants to go it alone and keep the Middle East or America's role in, let's say, the peace process as an American monopoly. I think he will be looking to try and involve other powers, the G7 certainly, in trying to find ways to contain the peripheral threats so that he is more able to focus his energies on China, Russia, and Western alliances and all the other points that were raised.
Thank you very much. Alastair, would you like to deal with the wider issues that were raised by David Haney?
Yes, I just like to comment, because also directly involved in both of these issues. It's quite clear to me that really there is quite a substantial element within Team Biden that wants to get out of the Middle East, not only Afghanistan, but Iraq. As you know, Biden has just said he will not renew the AUM, the 2002 authority for Iraq. And also, he has made some moves in not only that, but the Pentagon has said that when the evacuation of Afghanistan is complete, they will not support Afghanistan with air power during that, unless American lives are at risk. Two quite strong signals that they want to pivot away from the Middle East towards China, towards the focus of China. Indeed, that was the whole of the contention in the G7 and the G20. And it's right to ask, is this possible? I think the question about trying to keep Palestine calm is clearly going to come up, and there were some efforts of that by Washington during the process. But the question is also about Washington. Everyone has been so far really talking in the sort of sense of, the G7 and the European meetings. But in Washington, the advice has been coming from people like Dennis Ross, who's an old hand in the Obama, and it is, after all, an Obama-Clinton type team on the Palestinian issue, entirely an Obama-type team on the Palestinian issue. And they are saying no point in wasting capital, political capital, on this. No point in doing that. Much better for Biden just to put it to sleep and keep away from it. Too difficult. Finally, I just make a last comment, because I've been involved in the negotiations with Iran on the nuclear thing for some years altogether. I think there's only a very small window for an agreement, very narrow window indeed, because the Americans have still got some 600 or 700 sanctions that they are not going to remove. And Blinken made that very clear the other day when he said, we will remove many of the sanctions, but there will be about 500-600 that will stay until and when Iran changes its behavior. I think that was a very clear signal. And what I see in the internal polls, they're not for public, they're not for publicity, but the polls after the two television debates in Iran, Raisi is going to get a landslide, it looks like. I mean, the other candidates are trailing at sort of 5% and 9% in both, in the consequences of both those debates. Where is Iran moving then? Iran is moving east. It's moving to a much closer relationship with China. As you know, they have an agreement with China, which involves not just oil and infrastructure, but is about developing weapons and about technology. And so for Iran, technology has been the most important thing, and that they can get technology, mainly only really from China, and the investment to do that. So I think Iran is moving towards China. Michael.
Thank you very much. Jane, do you want to come in here or wait for another question?
I'll come in on Saudi and Iran in particular.
Okay.
I think that it's encouraging. There have been direct talks that have come out into the open, and these talks have been between the intelligence and security people. Those are likely to continue irrespective of the election results. And in some ways, I think the Saudis find it easier to handle hardliners from Iran. because they think that's the real nature of the government that they are dealing with there. I think the Saudis do themselves a disservice because their diplomacy about Iran is full of noise. But if you scratch the surface of it, what comes through really is a sense that we would accept Iran as a state in the region if it would rein in its sponsorship of non-state actors across the region. And there is something to be worked on there. It seems the initial talks have focused on Yemen. Of course, there are multiple regional conflicts that they'd need to discuss, and things are going in the wrong direction with others in the region also sponsoring non-state actors. But there is the beginnings of a possible bargain there. It's something maybe Europeans could help with, because I do agree that the US is not going to put a great deal of bandwidth into the Middle East, especially the issues that are going to be slow and long-term and take much more than Biden's 4 years.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on because time is obviously catching up with us. I'm going to ask Tony Brenton next to ask a question, followed by Peter Snow.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to our contributors for some very interesting thoughts. Well, all I was going to do is offer a couple of observations about the Russian role in all of this, if I may. And they have basically three concerns with regard to the Middle East. Firstly, and this hasn't been mentioned much, oil. They have a rather sweet deal with OPEC at the moment, under which the market is fixed, and they're all doing very well out of it. And they have a distinct interest in that being maintained, which means keeping MBS in place and keeping that part of the Arab world sweet. Secondly, fundamentalism. The Russians have an appalling domestic fundamentalist problem, as we saw through a couple of Chechen wars. And one of their core ambitions for the region is to keep fundamentalism under control. That's why they went into Syria. And they view the Western performance on this front with deep contempt. Their view of the West is that its inconsistencies, its flummoxing around, its concern for human rights, for which they have no time at all, of course, has simply made the situation there worse rather than better. And their third concern with the region is, you might put it, their general geopolitical standing, on which their feeling about what's going on there is rather mixed. On the one hand, as I've said, they despise what the West has done. They view the West as incompetent. They look at Biden in particular, whom they also regard as weak, and they see Biden withdrawing from Afghanistan, about to withdraw from Iraq, basically as the US as no more than token players in the region going forward. And as they look at this, they're happy that the West is being eclipsed in the region. They are less happy at the disorder which is likely to follow and likely to foster fundamentalism in the region. And I would guess that their reaction, when it's already visible, is that they're going to line themselves up in their relationships with the people whom they view as tough and secure in the region, which means the Iranians. Oddly, the Iranians have suffered under Western sanctions just as they have. The Iranians are coming through it. The Iranians are good and strong, and they've just sold them a load of military equipment as a demonstration of their interest there. Secondly, of course, Israel. And I think you can expect nothing more than tokenism with regard to the Palestinian issue in their dealings with Israel, in the view as hard and tough and effective allies. And thirdly, of course, the Turks also have not been mentioned in this discussion, but Erdogan is a buddy of Putin's despite their major differences, and they'll be very happy to maintain their links with the Turks on all of this. Sorry, no question there, but I think a little bit of context. Thanks.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Peter.
Mine's just a question. Can you hear me all right, Michael?
I can, yes.
Good. And mine's just a question. I mean, listening to Alastair Crooke, I was pretty downbeat about the Middle East for the last 10 years, but I'm even more so now. I hope he's wrong about the military balance tilting against Israel, because in a sense, that was a sort of stabilizing factor up to now. If the military balance is tilting against Israel, what effect will that have on Israel? And most importantly, we knew where we were with Netanyahu. I mean, bless his cotton socks, old baby, you know exactly what to expect from him. But what on earth are we to make of this new roadblock coalition? I mean, we have a situation where we have the chief man is more right-wing than Netanyahu. And yet, in a funny way, in that coalition, there are a sort of, by at least half, or not a majority of people, who are rather more progressive. So what, if anything, can you forecast will happen from Israel? I mean, we've just heard someone very rightly saying probably nothing, but is that right? Is it going to be nothing? Or is the tilt of the military balance going to help arm those who say we really must do something about Palestine.
Thank you very much. Jane, would you like to start off on that? And if we can keep it all brief, because we're beginning to run out of time.
We may expect that the new Israeli coalition won't last very long. It has a very slim majority, lots of internal divisions. It will be very similar to the outgoing government on foreign policy. It's trying to say exactly the same things about the Iran deal, and there is no majority in that coalition for any sort of agreement with the Palestinians. The focus will be internal, healing divisions, socio-economic, maybe a little bit more in terms of rights for Israeli Arabs, or 48 Palestinians, as they call themselves, which might be interesting. But I would be surprised if it lasts 4 years, and we can see Netanyahu's already positioning himself for a comeback, and so far hasn't bothered to move out of the Prime Minister's residence, which is quite interesting. I think Russia went into Syria to defend its own interests more than to fight fundamentalism, which is a region-wide problem. And Turkey might be a country that's contributed to some of the spread of radicalism in Syria, but there hasn't been any problem in Turkey and Russia working together to deconflict and find some kind of understanding there.
Thank you very much. Eugene, do you want to comment on those questions?
Unmuted. The mouse does not always cooperate. Yes, I think, this coalition in Israel needs only last long enough to allow the Israeli judiciary time to resolve the cases pending over Netanyahu. And if he is indeed found guilty of the charges, and they're serious charges, then Netanyahu will exit the political stage as a factor. And until he does, he will be a very powerful opposition figure. So, I don't give it 4 years, but I think that the people came together as much to see Netanyahu out of politics as to try and come into government themselves. And I think they have a motive to stay together just to leave the judiciary time to go through its court cases and prevent Netanyahu from changing the rules in a way that would spare him from their judgment.
Thank you. Alastair, have you got any comments on that?
Yes, I do. This new government is led by someone who believes in the annexation of Palestinian land, who was the chair of the Yesha Settler Council. And the majority are hard right-wingers. I just repeat to you, you don't have to accept it, but I have to say to you, that the worst thing you can be called in Israel at the moment is a leftist. Leftist is as bad as being termed a communist in other parts of the world at various times. I don't think, and the coalition government itself says, they're not going to touch anything contentious. I don't think, and the Palestinian issue is clearly contentious within in that element. They're not going to do that. They're going to concentrate on the economy and the pandemic. Those are the two issues which they say they're going to deal with. With the issue which Peter sort of talked about, the military balance. Just look, because the wake-up call was Aramco in September last year, when suddenly we had smart missiles arriving plumb center through all the cooling towers of Saudi Arabia's Aramco facilities. No one knows where they came from. Even now the intelligence services, those who had naval ships in the Gulf, cannot pinpoint the responsibility. This is the military strategic change that has taken place in the region, and which Israel faces, whether it is the rockets you saw from Gaza are nothing. Iranian policy is to allow, if you like, manufacture locally of rocket systems, not to give the weapons, but to allow indigenous construction with technical help. And so the rockets that were being used with Hamas, although they had quite some effect, are nothing like the rockets held by Hezbollah, and which has 20,000 of these ones. Even the Iraqis are now equipped with these. So you have a real sort of encirclement of Israel with smart cruise missiles and with drones which can disrupt radar. We saw a missile flying over radar over Israel only about 3 weeks ago, landing quite close to Dimona, the Dimona reactor, within 30 kilometers. It passed through 12 Israeli radar districts without being observed. I think it was clearly a trial run for what was happening. And I think that what you're seeing, and why I'm raising it, perhaps it seems a bit alarmist to some of you, but I'm just saying the military strategy is quite changed in the region. The military balance has changed. And if there is another thing, another provocation on the Temple Mount, you may find that other Hezbollah or even the Houthis are capable of firing their missiles into Israel. Don't forget, even during this last not very effective launch of missiles by Hamas, nearly 2/3 of Israelis were in the shelters for something like 2 weeks during the bombardment. Psychologically alone, that had a big impact on Israelis. I don't think you can look at anything. I think the last comment I made, because I know we're running out of time, and that which is basically, is there a prospect of the talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran are actually going quite well. I know that from the Iranian side, and they're quite serious. I think this is not a reflection of a newfound optimism for sort of getting on together with it. I think it's just simply a reflection that the Gulf states have come to the conclusion that the American security umbrella sooner or later is on the way out. And so they want to do some sort of outreach to Iran to avoid a conflict with Iran. I think it's a sign of weakness of Gulf states, not a sign of strength. Michael.
Thank you, Alastair. I'm going to take 2 more questions. If we can keep them brief, it would be very helpful to our timings. The first is David Logan and then James Barr. David.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks very much to the panel. I've got a question about borders. The artificial borders in the Middle East, which were drawn by Sykes and Picot, which have been, I think, a constant reason for unrest in the region. And I think from 2003 onwards, particularly from 2011, many people assumed that these states would break up and would be replaced by entities based on ethnicity, sectarianism, tribalism, warlord control, or other allegiances. But in practice, there's been a bit of conflict within these states, for example, Iraq and Syria, but the old borders have remained intact. The question I'd like to ask the panel is that because foreign powers such as the United States, Russia, and Iran find this an easier framework in which to defend their interests? And therefore, but for this interference, would these states by now have broken up, and might peace be a better prospect? Thank you.
James Barr.
My question, various others have asked the questions I was going to ask, but the one thing that interests me is lots of NGOs are doing work in the Middle East. Which of the initiatives you think are most interesting and most worthy of support from ordinary people?
Right. I'm going to ask Jane if she'd start off, because I think you have to get away after that. If you would like to respond.
Thank you so much. I think that on the NGO point, I think there are a lot of good organisations doing very quiet diplomacy behind the scenes, many of whom probably don't want to be massively publicised. But something that is good to support. And beyond that, I would underline, I think, the importance of a lot of the humanitarian and development charities that are working with refugees, children, marginalised groups across the region, who could do with more support, especially as the British government cuts aid to lots of them. The borders question is really interesting. I think it varies depending which place you're talking about, but it's not necessarily the case that people in the region do want to break away from their states and fight as they would have to do for a state based on sects. You know, Lebanon went through a civil war and it has held together as one state. In Iraq, what you've seen recently really is young people reacting against a sectarian system of power sharing and saying, hang on, just because the leader happens to be from the same religious group as me has not stopped him from taking my money, you know, and putting it into a Swiss bank account while I have no electricity. So I think it's a very, very brief answer to a very deep question, but I think the importance of these affiliations is quite often exaggerated.
Thank you. Alastair, would you like to comment finally?
Yes. I suppose I have to be a little bit blunt, but you know, I don't work in the Gulf states. I work in the rest of the region and with Russia and China in the Middle East. And I have to say to you that certainly as far as Russia and most countries are concerned, the EU is of no account whatsoever. They hold it in complete disesteem. They regard many of their NGOs, Western NGOs, as simply lecturing them on Western civilization models. And increasingly in those states, they see themselves as civilization models in their own right. Iran, Syria, Russia see themselves as civilizational states in their own right, with their own values, different values from European ones, and are getting rather irritated with being lectured on it. As for Western NGOs, I'm sure there are some that try and do some good work, but there are a lot who do a lot of bad work, very dangerous work. And I'm talking about those working in places like Idlib, which are working to, if you like, sustain and support HTS, Al-Qaeda, and extreme jihadists in Syria, in the hope of putting some leverage. We're in a state where the Syrians are starving. Many of the people just don't have food. And the European Union's position is to allow no reconstruction aid into Syria. And it uses its NGOs to provide only the support to those like the HTS, the Al-Qaeda groups in Syria. And I think those NGOs, we've seen a lot of publicity about their work and about their information efforts recently, has been leaked and exposed in the press. So it's all out there and public. But those have not been a very good advertisement for EU involvement in the region, I'm afraid. Sorry to bring this news, but I think it's important to be frank rather than just to be diplomatic about it. Michael.
Thank you very much for that. I think it is important to be frank on these occasions and to keep talking. Because too often, as you know, a very strong feeling of mine.
Yes, exactly.
We don't do the talking before the meeting. Our hour, sadly, is up. It's gone very, very quickly. A lot of people tell me they wanted to ask questions and I haven't managed to get to them. But hopefully we'll be able to do something like this again. I've just been reminded, Eugene, I didn't give you a chance to respond to that last question.
Well, I think that you had such good answers. To David Logan, I would only say that 100 years has created sovereign realities within those frontiers, and that they assert themselves still when they're being most questioned. And I think only the Kurds might push that under pressure, but I wouldn't think other groups are likely to change the borders such as we inherited. James Barr, by the way, would be my first authority on all lines in the sand questions. But in answer to James's question, all I would say is that most of the crises in the region seem to, in the end, come back to medicine, whether it's COVID or famine or conflict. And the one NGO that seems to me to be most meaningfully engaging is the Médecins Sans Frontières. And I've never seen them as anything other than the people who rescue the people. So I would say they stand out for me. But, you know, my colleagues have also addressed the issue.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. I was glad I got that in because I'm also a great supporter of Médecins Sans Frontières, so I'm grateful for that. I think we've had a very interesting talk. It is a very interesting topic, and you can only in an hour like this scratch the surface. But I hope we'll agree that this has been worthwhile and it's worth trying to do something like this again, not immediately, but perhaps in 2-3 months, where we can extend our conversation perhaps more widely. So anyway, can I first of all thank our speakers, Alastair, Eugene and Jane, very much for coming and giving us your time this morning. And secondly, to the rest of you, and in particular to one or two of you who wrote to me and said you were only going to see the first half of the programme and suggested that I might read a question of theirs. Sadly, I didn't even get round to that. But certainly if we do this again, they will be at the forefront of those who will ask questions. But thank you very much, and well, I hope to see you again soon.